backed by popular demand, let's continue with last week's session featuring Neil Kacena, who has been with us for several years after a very, very successful career at Lockheed Martin and Raytheon.
Neil, before you get started, I had a question for you. In your previous session last week, you were talking a little bit about the F-117, and I know a little bit about the history. We had done some historical view of the Skunk Works. With the Have Blue program, there were a couple of demonstrators. I understand that they had both crashed, and so I'm curious, I believe you were on the government side at the time. What was the perspective around the likelihood of success of this program after those crashes?
Actually, it was one of the classic demonstrations of reduction of risk, because both of the aircraft managed to get a number of test flights and demonstrate some critical risk areas before they crashed. And they, so with that and the knowledge that that was too small, that was a scale model, for demonstration of a couple of major risk areas. And that had basically been accomplished. So they were actually quite confident that when they scaled up to what became the F-117A, that would then probably succeed. So and in fact, I'll talk at the end of my discussion today. I've listed a number of books, one of which is Have Blue and the F-117A, which I would recommend to you is probably one of the premier program management texts and how-tos to really accomplish these kinds of things that's out there today. And I was involved in the commissioning and writing of it along with General George Molnar. So we can talk a little bit about that.
Okay,
excellent,
very good.
Excellent. So, we also had a question last week from Chuck Goddard, and he was asking, what was your view on why the A-12 was so unsuccessful? Well, I have some opinions about that as well, actually.
I would say that the contractors collectively totally fooled themselves into how much they had accomplished. This group knows well the key elements of tracking a project to completion and where you are with respect to cost, risk, schedule, et cetera, et cetera. I'll try to stay away from that right now, but they had lost the bubble on that, and they tried to show that they were ready for flight when they had a plywood mock-up was the best they had. And it was kind of amazing to me that this large group of multiple contractors, senior designers, et cetera, had just kind of lost the bubble. And Gates in 1990 canceled the program because when he saw it, it was clear to him that it was billions of dollars over cost if it could ever get there in the first place. Yeah. Short story, but there's a lot more that goes into that. In fact, I could talk an hour or two just on that.
Yeah, definitely. There was a whole, court battle around that, and the performance measurement system had the story. They weren't using it to report and to manage by.
Yeah, well, not only that, their major premise was the fact that the contractors had been kept in the dark on all of the other risk reduction efforts that were going on in DoD. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that was my first assignment at the Pentagon. I was actually the Air Force officer in charge of ensuring that the A-12 got all of the data that was happening in multiple other programs like the F-22, like the F-117, like the B-2, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the only good news is that I had documented that 6 ways to Sunday. And so the short story, you're going to be sorry to answer this question, was when I first went to Lockheed, I met a number of those people that were kind of smug senior engineers, program managers, smiling that they had kept their stock in GD because of this. They're going to get this huge payout when they won this suit. And I said, you're not going to get anything. In fact, you may have to pay for the lawyer's fees. Right. It's totally frivolous. And how they did that and why they did that, I'll just never know.
Yeah. Well, we better get back to your presentation, which I got to tell you, everybody was totally engaged and captivated last week. So over to you.
Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. So let's start out as I try to get this into the slideshow mode. This is where we left off, and I appreciate the response to my series of stories, which probably nobody really has any interest in. So thank you for at least telling me that there's something there. What I wanted to do is highlight about 3 elements on this chart, and then the next chart we'll spend the most time on. And then there's a whole series of charts that are either examples or more summary data at the end. So to jump right into it, I'll steer you down to Pentagon, which is the 4th sub bullet from the bottom. And at the end of that string of reminders for me is something that says R.E.L. Eaton. And I thought I might share this story that occurred in a duck blind in Maryland in my first tour at the Pentagon. And I had the opportunity to meet retired Major General Robert E. Lee Eaton, who it turns out was my dad's group commander of the Fighting 451st in World War II. And he invited me over to his duck blind. And so I spent a day with him. And for those of you concerned about the ducks, they all fared pretty well. Well, just listening to him chat was amazing, as he knew names like Tui Spots and Jimmy Doolittle and a whole host of Air Force, what I understood as greats. And he was on a first name basis with them. He was a combat commander as a colonel in World War II. But the reason I'm telling you this story is many in the audience might appreciate it, is R.E.L. Eaton, Robert E. Lee Eaton, was in fact obviously from the Deep South, and that was clear from how he talked across the board. And he told me a story which my dad later corroborated, I should say. And he said that, and he told me this just to tell me, is the first time, they're on their many missions north. I think this one was to the Hermann Göring Tank Works in Germany, which was a tough target, expected to lose a lot of aircraft. And the fighter escort arrived, and he could clearly, my dad, as the lead navigator for the mission, heard the fighters check in, flying P-51s. And it was clear that the flight lead was an African American. And Robert E. Lee Eaton responded that he wasn't very interested in that. And he was very concerned now for the safety of the flight. So his Southern background playing probably in this role. However, before he could even express that in more than just the tone of voice and the way he responded, 2 Messerschmitts were diving in on his tail and on his flight. And before he could say anything, the red tails of the Tuskegee Airmen were in the middle of it, knocking down Messerschmitts, and they lost no aircraft going to then the toughest target in Europe. So in that one day, and then as my father said, big smile came over his face every time the Red Tails checked in on future escort missions. And I think, and what he told me was that really changed his overall outlook and sense after a whole history of growing up to the rank of colonel in a much different environment. So I share that story that I got in a duck blind in Maryland, across the board. Wanted to jump down to Qatar, and we could talk all day about this one too, but I wanted to indicate that one of the challenges in the military is you may have a boss, but I actually had 5 bosses there, which included the ambassador. And the ambassador was just a grand gentleman by the name of Kenton Keith. And he happened to be, as a as a naval lieutenant. He was a deck officer on the Midway in Vietnam in the South China Sea. And so he and I got along great, although his staff and the State Department and I were not on the grandest terms. In fact, the State Department did not allow me to go into the embassy's most secret part. And this was in a small embassy, and its classification was only confidential. So when I got there, while we had the task of building the secret air base, Al Udeid in Qatar, which has been used ever since that time extensively, and putting preposition Army equipment and other things into Qatar, I really needed a secure capability to talk to CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa. And finally, I talked to my boss, a gentleman by the name of Major General Paul J. Vanderplug, who basically filled up a door completely. So probably had a previous career in the NFL. Anyway, he was very clear on what he wanted done and how to do it. And I personally liked that, although others didn't. Anyway, I told him that I couldn't possibly do this job without secure communications. And so he said, okay, we'll fix that. And he sent over a lieutenant colonel with a bag on the next trip. And in it was a Stu-3. So those of you that know Stu-3s know it's encrypted phone communication. But I had no place to put it in the embassy because I didn't have any classified area. I basically had no place to put it. So with the commander's approval, I installed it under my bed in the compound in the house that I was living in Qatar. And so one day the ambassador asked me, he really needed to talk to the State Department. Something had occurred, not important, but it was a highly classified level. And he didn't have the capability to even call them in a timely manner and let them know. So I asked Kenton, I said, well, maybe you want to stop by for a aperitif after work. If you can wait that long, does that work? He goes, yes. So when he got to my house, we retired to the master bedroom in this compound that we were living in. And under the bed is the Stu-3. So the ambassador makes his phone call. This is obviously coloring well outside the lines in normal process and procedures. And he was very grateful for that. Although my wife said, what is it that you and the ambassador were doing in our bedroom? And why is he in there sitting on our bed talking on the phone? So those of you that might be challenged to explain these kinds of occurrences, just think about that for a while. Anyway, all was well, and not everybody operates with the Stu-3 under their bed, but I had done that for a while. We take a look at the bottom of this chart. I would say this is the 3 phrase mnemonic that I put together ultimately, or borrowed or stole, on really focused on leadership. How do you lead? Lead is obviously upfront, by example. Follow is really the art of delegation and motivation to your team, to highlight the vision, explain the vision, where are you going, how are the good ways to get there, but then allow them to find their own path to get there, which means in many cases they probably know more than you do, so follow them, support them. And last is really the last element of that support: get out of the way, simply meaning, think of one of your jobs is you've got to be commanding a D9 bulldozer, and you have to remove barriers from the people that are trying to accomplish their mission on your overall team. All right, continued. This gets into the industry side, and I'll just highlight a couple of these elements because you're thinking that you might be interested in some of these stories. I moved on to the Skunk Works, which was a dream job for me that allowed me to use a lot of the things that I had learned in the Air Force and really focus on innovation. I joined Lockheed at a time there was lots of consolidation going on within LM Aero, within Lockheed, and I got involved directly or leading the Skunk Works reorganization, which was a thrill. I also got there at the time of the JSF competition. which is where I ran into SMA. I don't know if it's still the largest effort that you've ever done, but it certainly is the largest DoD program. It was the largest competition at that time, and it still is by far the largest DoD program out there. So that proposal process put me in direct association and working directly with some key SMA folks at the time, and I really enjoyed that process going forward. And you can see that JSF prototypes picture over on the right to give you a sense of that. And so not only did we have the proposal, we had the prototypes, which we needed to win the proposal. So we were building those at the Skunk Works. And then to transition the program where it was actually going to be able to be manufactured by location, prototypes were built in Palmdale at the Skunk Works. The aircraft was going to be built in Fort Worth. So that may have been the most challenging of all those. Also at that time, I met the Lockheed proposal lead, who was just a grand gentleman by the name of Frank Capuccio. So those of you who have met and talked to Capuccio already know that. But then I had the great honor to work for him for about the next 15 years as he became the chief skunk across the board. One of the interesting things I was allowed to do there is we had a major program, which I still can't tell you exactly what it is, but it had run into trouble with the customer right at the IOC phase, initial operating capability. It was really the test phase for us, but to get it into the fleet and operating on a daily basis. And so I took over as the program manager to really try to take my operational experience and drive it into the program so the customer fully understood and was, I think ultimately, at least we ultimately succeeded in getting the capability to IOC. A third thing, example of a challenge, particularly for leadership in the innovation business, is resource allocation. And that's a whole nother 2-hour discussion I'd be happy to go into, but how you think through how to allocate resources to various levels of innovation and production in an overall entity. And I note company customer mismatch up here. And the example I'd like to tell you is 2 areas. One is the Skunk Works had a X-55 ACCA, which the Skunk Works built, the advanced composite cargo aircraft. And the goal was to demonstrate how to build an aircraft, in this case, a transport aircraft, out of composites. And we selected a deal, that's a Donier 328J as the donor aircraft, and decided that we wanted to keep the engines and keep the cockpit to reduce the cost. And then we rebuilt the rest of the airplane out of composites. A lot of stories there, but the major challenge, after a successful initial test flight, AFRL was the customer, and it finally occurred to everyone involved that the B basis allowables, and if you look in the lower left-hand corner, those of you that aren't too familiar with A basis and B basis, basically are a set of allowables and performance standards that have been applied to aircraft and other construction elements forever. And on a metal aircraft, those are about 100 years old and widely available and totally trusted. At this time in the early 2000s, composites, they weren't. And AFRL finally figured out that we really didn't have any B basis allowables, or we didn't have many. And to get all the ones that they would normally want to look at and design to, they would have to spend 100 times more than they spent on the modification and demonstration of this aircraft. And so it was turned out to the junkyard, and none of the follow-on testing was done. Another example is the KC-130J. Many of you might be familiar if I've got some Marines out there, Semper Fi. This is the Marine Corps' C-130, that's their tanker, and now dual aircraft, and they wanted to make it into a sensor and a weapons shooter as well, particularly for places like Afghanistan or in the Middle East. And so it was a program called Harvest Hawk, at which we did exactly that, basically put a EOIR ball on a fuel tank and added Hellfire missiles, as well as other missiles, and located in what's called the Derringer door, one of the weapons areas in the aircraft. Instead of the door, we built the weapons launch right into the door, so the aircraft didn't have to be depressurized to go ahead and fire those kinds of weapons. Roll on, roll off command, and we had, as I recall, 17 equivalent heads working on the program, people on the entire program. And that was probably maybe 7 or 8 full-time and maybe another 20 or so doing part-time. When they decided to go ahead with the program and Nav Air took over all of the interface for the Marine Corps, and they had the first review, not only was the whole Skunk Works was surprised, but I was surprised as well. For the 17 people that we had, 17 full-time equivalents we had working on the program, 124 reviewers showed up from Nav Air. And one of the first things I said, well, it's clear to me that we are going to need to triple the cost of the program just to fund all the reviews and other data that you're going to want from this program, if this is how we're going to do it now. So another interesting process on where we're going today. I had a stint on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, and there are some smart people there. I really enjoyed that. And just listening to them was awesome. On to Raytheon, and probably I said the title that I ended up with there probably describes a lot of what I showed you in that first chart of how my interests have focused on tech innovation, strategic pursuits. Lots of cross-business unit integration challenges and issues. You may have noticed the headlines just the other day that Raytheon's still in that business as they're reducing the number of business units and trying to focus on efficiency. By the way, same big challenges in Lockheed Martin. So the major DoD contractors all have a history of how they've acquired capabilities and business units, and how do you continually weld them together to get the best product is something that's not unusual at all. And then after the third retirement, which was Raytheon, I managed to then say, well, I still want to keep my fingers into this game a little bit. And so I've focused on my own LLC across the board to make that happen. But I would highlight that the bottom line there is really in this business is how do you make the trades? How do you gather the data and do it in a timely fashion to make the trades and determine how and where you're going to go and make decisions for the future? And if you feel like I'm racing, I am, because I'm trying to get to the point where potentially you can ask some questions at the end. I won't dwell on this chart a lot, simply to say this is out of another probably 3-hour presentation on the Skunk Works. And what it tries to take a look at are what are the original Kelly Johnson 14 laws? Do they still apply today? And if so, how would you change the terminology? Or is the terminology changed? And what is it? I'll jump right to number 6. That's what I was talking about before when Jock, you asked about the A12. EVMS was in effect was so far off on the A12 that they didn't even see it or realize it. They had a plywood mock-up at best, and they thought they were going to fly in 2 months. So it was kind of one of those things. But you'll see there's nothing that should surprise you in here. So all I will say about Kelly's 14 laws it's not so much a secret as what are they, but it's how do you have a team and an organization that has both the commitment and the culture to actually execute in this fashion. Mitch Forey asked a question on the stealth fighter. This is what I'd say: if the program manager has not read this book and does not have this in hand. And by the way, I have no touch. I mean, I do know Dave Ehrenstein and Al Piccirillo, and actually they are two retired Air Force colonels at the time in the late 90s, worked for, some of you may remember Answer, which provided bodies at the Pentagon, which is still done. It's a different organization. They both worked for Answer, and they put together what I think is a very highly documented and supported history of Have Blue and the 117. But in doing so, they illustrated all the key elements of program management. So when people ask me, what can you tell me about program management, or how would you describe it? I send them to this and tell them this is the handbook. You know, if you, all of you know the gospel of program management, how do I make the trades on technical, schedule, and cost across the board? Well, I would argue that this book really takes that on in a very straightforward fashion, and you might find it useful, even though it's circa 97, I think, or 98. Towards the end, so what I would tell you, and this is, learning, so to speak, is all the things we talk about in the how to, and how you organize, and how you go forward, and how you execute EVMS. It's really all about the people and how you focus on how they come together. You saw teamwork as part of the triangle that I showed you in my, simplified thought process up front, but it really is all about the people. And you're finding those that have passion for solutions. I want to solve the problem. I want to get there. And yet they have to have tolerance for failure. And those are the two criteria, particularly for the Skunk Works, I would say, for the culture. I think I mentioned earlier, there were many people that actually wanted to go there, wanted to be there, and they did not, I concluded, they did not handle change well, or they weren't adapted to change, and particularly the uncertainty associated with change. And so many of them on their own wanted to go back to home base, for instance, Fort Worth. I want to go back where I know how we're going to spend a lot of time figuring out how I'm going to drill this hole and how I'm going to get that rivet in there exactly right. I'm being facetious here, but that kind of thought process. Okay, I warned you that there were some books that I thought I'd throw out for this group you may or may not be interested in. And these are, and I want to assure you that I did learn to read before 1995, even though that's the earliest book out here. But regardless, these books mostly are things that confirmed what I thought I had seen, observed, and had come to believe were correct and good descriptors of the environment that we operate in. Stealth, much more than what stealth is, because I couldn't really say that much about stealth because of the classified nature, but you can go back to simply to things like camouflage and 100 years ago in the Civil War, if you want to, and say that's stealth. So bottom line is this particular book, I wrote it, but I think it's more about the way the U.S. thinks, or the American way of war, than it is specifically about stealth. We talked about Have Blue and the 117 across the board. The Army at Dawn, there's two really military, or three, but the Army at Dawn is about the war in North Africa and the U.S. real entry really into World War II. And it's a part of a trilogy. And I found that book to be just fascinating, with data and insights that I had not understood. And I've been particularly a World War II historian or interested in World War II history for a long time. But I would say that a couple of things, and you can see on the right across from that, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, which most people understand was the U.S. was soundly defeated in North Africa in their first engagement, inexperienced troops, and primarily lack of leadership. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved. Patton took over. A lot of you people know the story, saw the movie, bought the T-shirt. But this is a guy that was trying to lead from the front, from the back. And he delegated, but he delegated about 3 levels down in the organization. So you can think of a lieutenant right in the midst of the battlefield has been delegated anything that he can make all decisions, but there was nobody pulling the whole thing together and nobody at the front that understood what was going on. So it was, I think, really a significant example. The other, for air power enthusiasts like myself, and play on Sarah's information on the Imperial War Museum and London, and particularly the Battle of Britain, which is another great topic. Don't get me started on the doubting system. But Air Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham was really the architect of modern air power doctrine. And he was the one that advocated from a UK commander's point of view, and he was in charge of that entire organization, all the air, and pulled it all together and actually made it work. When the US Air Force, US Army Air Corps would just, I'm going to allocate 5 fighters to this unit on the front line and 5 fighters here. They call it penny packets. He was the one that finally finally illustrated and architected the way to effectively employ an Air Force in combat. So some really good stuff there. Science, Strategy, and War is much better than reading On War by Clausewitz. And I read it. I also read in junior high The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, or at least I paged through all the pages, But anyway, I think you'll find that Boyd, particularly in the words of Franz Osigna, who is a Dutch fighter pilot, by the way, an F-16 guy, and he wrote this as a treatise for Air War College, which is exactly what I did on the stealth thing above. But his is much better, and it really captures John Boyd's thinking all the way from his development of energy maneuverability, which is 1v1, fighter on fighter, so to speak, to really being the strategic leader of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And he will focus a lot on uncertainty. You see one of his quotes here, and you'll see several of his quotes around there. So he deals with uncertainty, perception. He is given, or he has been, he is the author of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. Orient being the most important part of that. So a lot of discussion there, and particularly as we look at combined joint all-domain command and control, where DoD is going. And China, I want to know everything. I want all the data. I want it all right now. And then I want to make the best execution, the best decisions based on that, or decision superiority. That's a challenge, but Boyd certainly has a lot to say about that, and can really be a thing to talk about. Speed of trust. This goes back to people. It's all about the people. And this is coming from an engineer, by the way. And so I thought that Covey's book that came out in 2006, Speed of Trust, really spoke to me and confirmed what I had already either thought of or was thinking or didn't realize, but now saw, that kind of thought process. So I would recommend trust is a critical element. Outliers, for those of you that haven't read that, is all about, it's a story of success. But if I had to summarize it, I'd say you have to do something 10,000 times, or they highlighted it's the number of reps to be an absolute expert. 10,000, and it goes into all, this is sports, engineering, whatever field you want to talk to, some that you won't even imagine. But his theory of success and outliers, I would say that another Air War College treatise that's not on here, but it was clearly about fighter pilots and actually about aces. So how many fighters are lost in combat. And there's lots of documentation about that, because a lot of people were interested through the wars, going back to World War I. Some of it's a little questionable, but there's enough to overcome that. And the bottom line, it shouldn't come as any surprise to you, that 10% of the fighter pilots accounted for 90% of the kills, regardless of country, regardless of war, regardless of anything. So again, really confirmed what I was thinking. And last, and this is another tip to the Navy. I mentioned the Marine Corps Semper Fi. I got to talk to my buddies in the Navy. U.S. Navy, if you haven't read about Guadalcanal, you don't know where it is, there is a microcosm of World War II and the U.S. and really thought process. This airfield, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, right after Midway in World War II, and it's talked about a land battle, or it's talked. It was all about preserving and operating the runway, Henderson Field, so the air power. Japanese Navy was stronger at the time, I could say, and so there were a number of battles and significant losses to the U.S. Navy trying to protect the airfield. It turns out that the number of ships lost by the Japanese and Americans are about the same. The aircraft lost by both were about the same. But the Marines, and then later being reinforced by the Army, more teamwork, really ended up with over a 10-to-1 ratio of Japanese Army killed versus Allied, and therefore won the Battle of Guadalcanal, and that was really the first step on the way to Tokyo. Again, this particular author does a great job of taking you through that. If you look just below that, one of my favorite quotes, of the many there, is this quote by Ching Lee, who is Rear Admiral Willis Ching, aka Ching Lee, who is actually the commander of Battleship Division 6. He was on the bridge of the Washington when the Washington and South Dakota, the only two U.S. fast battleships available at the time, went down the slot at night in an area where they normally wouldn't even steam because it was too shallow, too constricted, not enough going on. In the fog of war, which he had absolutely no idea what was going on, the communication, the weather, everything was totally unavailable. And the South Dakota had already been bloodied. He had lost 4 destroyers, and he just, in the fog of war, he took on what he knew. He was the premier gun guy in the Navy at the time as a 2-star admiral. He knew everything there was to know about training the big guns on the battleships and be an accurate target, getting there with speed and following up. And so he shouts on the radio, because they couldn't tell who was friend and who was foe. Stand aside, I'm coming through. This is Ching Lee, Ching being his nickname or his TAC call sign. I'm Admiral Lee, I'm Ching Lee, and I'm coming. And he took the Washington and basically destroyed the Japanese battleship and a couple of destroyers when he was unprotected. The rest of his fleet had been damaged, destroyed, not there. He won that battle by sheer confidence in his group, his teamwork, his team, and coming back. So lots of corporate lessons learned here. Again, I'm sorry you got me going. I'm taking on. So questions, you'll see some more John Boyd quotes here that I think tried to illustrate some things that you might be looking for, might be useful to you. So this tour that I've taken you on, again, I very, very much appreciate you letting me talk. And I recognize it probably doesn't make much sense to you, but another critical learning item to me is sometimes it's just better to be lucky than good.
Well, Neil, I got to say, wow, this is incredible, and we certainly have enjoyed both the session last week and the session this week. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you chatting with us today. And I know there's so many questions. I do agree with you on the A12. EVMS was they ignored it, and they paid the price.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to see, that reading list, I already have a backlog, but if we can somehow get that and distribute that, I think that would be fantastic. I think a lot of those books sounded really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I got to ask this question, Neil, because, we all like adventure movies and whatnot, but when I saw the most recent one, and there on the controls was the skunk in Top Gun, I almost jumped out of my seat in the movie theater. I got to tell you, you see that, I was like, look, it's the skunk.
Oh,
What do you
yeah,
think about that movie?
Absolutely. Well, that other than being totally incorrect,
Of course.
well, I mean, the fact that you would use an F-18 instead of an F-35 for that mission is the first one, and that's just ridiculous. And the explanation was ridiculous.
Yep.
They
I will
needed
say
two
that
seats, that's why.
I like both the first Top Gun and the last Top Gun. Just like I like Star Wars, and like many fighter pilots talk about the bar scene in Star Wars of all the weird creatures and they go, well, that's like the O Club.
Definitely so.
So I will give Tom Cruise credit for, the one specific I would say is why they picked the F-18 really was he wanted to have, or this is what he said, and I believe it, he wanted to have the most accurate depiction of what it's like to be flying in the cockpit in that environment. And so the actors flew in the back seat of the F-18, and then they were kind of photoshopped as like they were in the front seat where the real pilot was. But the bottom line is that's why he did it. So they had a back seat available to do that. And they could see the tense, the pressure under G, you could see the face flapping around, the oxygen mask, all that kind of stuff, which I think did a pretty good job of capturing that environment. Now, where are you going to find a Tomcat today to escape in? I don't know. I mean, they're
in Iran, obviously.
Yeah, no kidding. Right.
all that is a big stretch, but I enjoyed the macro theme.
Right. Yeah. It's always fun to have a little fiction, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Hey,
So I don't know if you have time or you want have anybody else have any questions, but
I think we're kind of over on time,
yeah,
but this has really been fascinating.
It has been, and gosh, again, thank you so much for taking the time with us. This was incredible. The feedback that we've gotten from everybody has just been resoundingly, more. They want more. So we'll have you back again for sure, because I think there's so much to talk about and so many things that you've done. But
I think
again,
each one of those bullets would have been a whole session by itself.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.